This game, Titanfall 2, is one of the top 5 best FPS games I have ever played.
Titanfall 2 is a masterpiece.
Respawn Entertainment released one of the most exhilarating and
Why
engaging
in the
shooter
world can't I stop playing Titanfall 2?
Undervalued by developer Respawn Entertainment and publisher EA since, it may never receive a sequel despite its incredibly high quality, and is part of a series which, at the time of recording this video, is practically dead in the water.
Respawn Entertainment began in the year 2010 and was founded by Jason West and Vince Zampella. The studio, at least at the start, was formed entirely of Infinity Ward developers who were tired of working under the overbearing Activision. These developers were known for creating some of the best COD titles of all time, COD 4 and Modern Warfare 2. Now keep in mind, everything I'm about to go into is just a legend, so Activision lawyers don't get any ideas. Anyways, during the development of Modern Warfare 3, Activision and Infinity Ward got in a huge dispute. The reason for this dispute is because of Activision's decision to fire Jason West and Vince Zampella on accusations of insubordination. They believed that half of Infinity Ward staff, along with Vince Zampella and Jason West, were planning to leave Infinity Ward and start their own company under EA. This led to countersuits against Activision being filed, alleging that they had withheld bonuses from employees that were owed from the MW2 development, and another lawsuit was filed by 40 employees of Infinity Ward, alleging that Activision were withholding bonuses from their employees until the completion of Modern Warfare 3. Also, throughout this legal battle, employees were alleging that Activision was intimidating their employees into submission by hiring security guards, having random interrogations, and much more. In light of the recent news revolving around Activision, I'm more inclined to believe the developers on this part of the suit. However, the firing seems to have been legitimate, as we'll get into in a moment. Anyways, after all of this legal battling, Respawn Entertainment was created with those that left the company. The studio knew they had to come up with an idea for a new shooter title, since it was the type of development they were familiar with that could compete with Call of Duty. So they came up with the idea to create a game with advanced movement, futuristic tech, and best of all, mechs that could be operated by the player. This idea would eventually become Titanfall 1 as we know it today, and its release date was focused on the 8th generation consoles. However, the team's small size, less than a quarter of other AAA studios, made it difficult to develop the game quickly and to acquire funding. But they were eventually able to get EA as their publisher, which is kind of ironic considering Activision's allegations earlier, and talks about exclusivity began for their first title. As time passed, they decided to sign an exclusivity deal with Xbox that would keep Titanfall 1 off of PlayStation for the life of the title. And with funding secured, they were able to spend more time ironing out the game before launch. You have to keep in mind that developing Titanfall takes a lot of effort. They had to perfect the gameplay between Titans and pilots, because if the Titans were too strong, you would feel helpless without them. But if they made Titans too weak, they would feel like a pointless feature. Not to mention the fact that maps had to be developed with both of these aspects in mind, which is unlike anything that any developer had ever done before. So, Respawn had to tread lightly and spend a lot of time perfecting the formula. They also had to spend a lot of time ironing out the universe, as we'll get into later in this video, and they had to perfect the art style. On top of all of this, they were making the rather controversial decision, at least for the game's time, to not release the game with a single player campaign. As we discussed in my downfall of the Call of Duty franchise video, before the modern day, single player experiences were extremely important, arguably more important than multiplayer due to less people being connected to the internet. Call of Duty's games at the time were releasing with a zombie side mode and a campaign. Halo obviously had its infamous campaigns, and it also had Firefight, and pretty much every other shooter had some way to play offline single player. Respawn's decision to go against the grain on this was, I'm sure, a difficult one to make, especially since they were wanting to charge full price for the game, which had potential to backfire and cause lower sales numbers. But the real question is, how did it perform? Well, to answer that, we must make our way back to the release of the Xbox One, one of the most controversial consoles of recent years. The Xbox One was announced on May 21st, 2013, and during the reveal, it was immediately apparent that the console was going to have some problems. Not only was the name Xbox One a confusing naming scheme, but the huge emphasis on the Xbox acting as an infotainment system and the addition of the Kinect turned a lot of people off. Also, the rumor that the new Xbox would require online connectivity and the removal of game sharing made Xbox fans that were looking for a new gaming console to frantically look elsewhere. And conveniently for PlayStation, they were right there ready to sweep up all of those players leaving the console. This is perfectly reflected in the sales numbers, with PlayStation selling 117 million PS4s, while Xbox only sold 58 million of their new console, the Xbox One. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, what does this have to do with Titanfall? Well, you remember that exclusivity deal I mentioned earlier? Yeah. Well, now Titanfall was stuck on the mismarketed and horribly managed Xbox One, which would limit its potential growth. Despite the obvious challenges this presented, Respawn still had to release the game, and so they did, roughly 4 months after the Xbox One's release on March 11th, 2014. And the game actually sold pretty well, doing close to 1 million sales in the first month. Obviously, this was nothing compared to the sales numbers they were used to seeing in the Call of Duty franchise, but it was still exceptional considering that they were a brand new studio releasing on an underperforming console with a brand new IP. And what they may not have made in sales, they made up for massively in their reputation, because this game would be praised for years for being one of the most influential shooters ever released. The reason for this is quite lengthy, so I want to go in depth on everything Titanfall 1 was praised for. The first and the most obvious is its implementation of Titans, and at the time, there really weren't any competitors in the mech genre that had managed to balance their strength quite like Titanfall, especially if you take into account the fact that the game also had pilots that had to go against them. The game did a great job of making the Titans feel strong without making them feel impossible to defeat as a pilot. But outside of just the Titans, the game was also praised for its gameplay on the pilot side of things as well. Firstly, the game has a buttery smooth and quick time to kill, which makes every single weapon feel somewhat useful, and it makes them satisfying to use. This mixed in with the amazing movement made for a great gameplay experience for the players. The game had features like wall running, mantling, and much more. All of this movement was really unheard of at the time for a first-person shooter, especially wall running, which was pretty much popularized by this title. People loved this gameplay so much that Call of Duty would try to copy it themselves over to their next 3 games, which is a whole topic in and of itself. Then, the last portion of the game that was praised is its map design. As you likely know, if the game has Titans, pilots with advanced movement, and even grunts and other side enemies, the map will have to accommodate all of the different ways to play. Respawn managed to knock it out of the park in this aspect. Every map had ways to wall run and areas to hide as a pilot, areas for Titans to duke it out, and common funnel points where each can go head to head. I'll be honest, I think this is one of the most impressive parts of the game because no other games have had to balance gameplay like this. Having to balance 2 completely different gameplay styles in a single map really hadn't been done before, and if the maps weren't good enough, the game would have likely failed. However, despite all the amazing praise this game got, there are still a couple of issues that are worth addressing. Firstly, and arguably the biggest, is the fact that it didn't have a campaign, as I mentioned earlier. Instead of having a normal single-player campaign, Respawn Entertainment, in an effort to build the universe, made a multiplayer campaign, which basically gave you a unique start animation, unique voice lines, in-game soundtracks, and a unique in-game animation inside a normal multiplayer game. Now, this story was quite shallow, and it did have a lot of issues. However, this campaign of sorts was quite important. It laid the foundation for the Titanfall universe, and it helped to establish a lot of the important characters of the series. So at the end of the day, I still think it was better than nothing at all. Also, another big and valid criticism of the game is that it had a lot of balancing issues. Some guns are just blatantly better than others. The Spitfire is one of the worst weapons in the game, while there is a literal pistol with aimbot that you can equip. The same thing applies to the Titan side of things. For example, the Vortex Shield is just an objectively better tactical than something like Electric Smoke. This obvious balancing flaw can make players feel less free to customize their Titans the way they want, and more inclined to play the most optimal way possible. Then, the final complaint levied against the game was its lack of content variety. The game only had 10 primary weapons, 3 sidearms, and 4 anti-Titan weapons. Especially considering that there was only 1 shotgun, 2 snipers, and 1 LMG, it was clear that there was a real problem when it came to mixing up the gameplay. This made it hard to find variety in each game since most people just used the same 4 or 5 weapons. However, all of this taught Respawn a lot about developing the series, and it prepared them for the future. And considering they wanted to make a sequel, this information would be extremely important. But for the time being, Respawn was focused mainly on creating new content for their original title. Over the next year, they would pump out 3 map packs, each with 3 new maps to the game. For other games, this wouldn't be that big of a feat for a studio to achieve, but once again, since making maps for this game took a lot of extra time and attention, this honestly wasn't that bad. And some of these maps, like war games, would become iconic in the series. But once they had finished the DLCs for the game, their eyes were set on the sequel, one that would hopefully allow the franchise to achieve mainstream success, and they would begin development in mid-2014. But this task wasn't as easy as originally thought. Titanfall 2's development had to solve a lot of the problems in the series. First off, they needed to solve the problem of low engagement that Titanfall 1 had after launch, because while it did sell well, the player count dropped quickly afterwards. Secondly, they needed to do a better job of establishing the universe with an actual campaign. And finally, they needed to ensure that the balancing of this game was a lot better than the previous title. This was a massive uphill battle that they had to win. However, with Vince Zampella as the CEO, over 90 developers working on this new title, and 2 years to get it done, it actually seemed pretty plausible. However, something that is important to note is the difficulties that came with making a campaign for Titanfall. The reason for this difficulty is that the Respawn developers were largely comprised of ex-Infinity Ward developers, meaning that they were used to developing campaigns in the COD format. So the initial script writing and design process for the story took a lot longer than expected, since they had no idea how to create missions and plot lines that revolved around the Titanfall formula. Because of this, Titanfall 2's campaign was developed in a weird way compared to other games in the industry. Instead of writing the campaign and scripting the missions first, Respawn decided to design the levels and the gameplay first and then develop the story later. This approach made it easier for Respawn to make the campaign around the mechanics of the series, like wall running, by visualizing it all in the engine. This also contributed to the campaign's gameplay being one of the best in the FPS genre, since they put such a focus on making every level fit with the movement. So using this method of development, they were able to get the campaign done on time, and since the multiplayer of Titanfall 1 was so perfect, they didn't want to change much about it, and they were able to get it done rather easily. All they had to do was add some more guns, change the Titan customization, and create new maps. And with everything on the development side of things complete, and the sequel being announced in March of 2015, the game was officially ready to launch.
Stand by for Titanfall!
Titanfall 2 was released on October 28th, 2016, and immediately upon release, it was praised as being one of the best shooters ever created. This is for 3 big reasons, which I will get into now. Firstly, it had one of the best campaigns ever made. The story opens up with us, the player, controlling Rifleman Jack Cooper. Eventually, we encounter a pilot and his Vanguard Titan, BT. We witness them go up against a group of mercenaries called the Apex Predators. Unfortunately, the Apex Predators were able to best the pilot and kill him. However, before his death, he was able to transfer control of his Titan, BT, over to the protagonist, Jack Cooper. And this is where the story truly begins, because the rest of the campaign, we follow Jack Cooper and BT together as they fight off the IMC and other mercenary groups to help the militia win the fight for the Frontier's independence. I know the game is pretty old now, 7 years old in fact, but just in case you all haven't played through the campaign, I won't be going any deeper into the story. This is genuinely my favorite single player experience I've ever played when it comes to the FPS genre. The story is absolutely amazing, and the ending is one of the best I've ever seen. It is a bit of a cliffhanger, which is sad considering the state of the series today, but it is still worth playing. Also, the gameplay of each mission holds up to the rest of the franchise, and the idea to allow BT to unlock new loadout options as the mission progresses adds way more gameplay variety. Then, outside of the campaign, the second reason why the game was praised was for new changes to the multiplayer. Not only did the game have the same smooth mechanics that were established in the original Titanfall, but Titanfall 2 added on to them, like the introduction of sliding, which had an insane effect on movement to the series. If you watch any top tier Titanfall player playing this game, you'll see how important the introduction of this mechanic was for the game's meta. Slide jumping, also known as B-hopping, quickly became synonymous with Titanfall, and sliding would also be useful for other crucial speedrunner tactics like nade jumping. The fact that adding something as simple as sliding had such a huge effect on the series goes to show how complex the movement was as a whole. But sliding wasn't the only thing that Titanfall 2 implemented. The multiplayer also had the Titan system completely changed. Instead of there being 3 Titan classes based on movement speed, a large amount of Titan weapons on each class, and even more abilities to choose from on each class, in Titanfall 2, they decided to completely scrap the system. Instead, the Titans were broke up into 7 different classes. Each had their own unique loadouts with completely unique weapons, tactical abilities, and cores. Weapons, tacticals, and cores obviously were integral to the first game, but the difference here was that each class had everything tailored to their playstyle. For example, the North Star Titan had fast movement speed, a sniper unique to it, traps that were useful to keep people at a distance, and a cluster missile to help fend people off. Another example is the Ronin Titan, which was good for up-close engagements, with it also having fast speeds, a shotgun, a good sword as a melee weapon, and tacticals that helped it get up close to its opponents. This meant that each class had their own strengths and weaknesses that allowed them to be extremely interesting to play with. And while the customization may have suffered due to the narrowing down of each class, at the end of the day, this sacrifice was clearly worth it. Another thing that this game was praised for was the large amount of weapons it had on launch. Titanfall 2 had 29 different weapons, which was a lot more than Titanfall 1, and they were spread across multiple different weapon types. That meant more shotguns, more snipers, and more LMGs to play around with. But after the multiplayer, the final thing that was praised with this game was the balancing. This technically ties into the game's multiplayer, but I figured it was worth mentioning separately. If you remember me saying earlier, Titanfall 1 had a huge problem with balancing disparity. Some guns were just objectively better than others, and some Titan loadouts were just objectively the best. This led to a big problem in Titanfall 1 of people running the same loadouts over and over again. But Titanfall 2 managed to fix that. While the game may have had some obviously strong things like the tone, which no one likes, every weapon in Titan were still viable, and you'll be happy to know that they managed to balance the absolutely busted smart pistol from Titanfall 1 by making it a boost, which was a great idea. Now, even though pretty much every aspect of this game was praised by players who played it, how did it perform? Well, it was actually one of EA's most disappointing titles in history. EA expected Titanfall 2 to sell 10 million copies in the first year or more. However, Titanfall 2 would only end up doing half of that. Also, the game sold a quarter of what Titanfall 1 managed to sell in its first week, despite Titanfall 2 releasing on all platforms. Now, this may seem weird because why would a game that was so beloved be performing so poorly in the mainstream? There are a few main theories behind this that I want to go over real quick. The first, and I would argue the best argument on why this was the case, was the release date of the title. If you didn't know, Titanfall 2's release date was sandwiched between 2 different major titles, those being Battlefield 1 and Call of Duty Infinite Warfare. This meant that Titanfall had to compete against 2 FPS giants for the same audience, which was a tough thing to accomplish on its own. But considering these games had probably double the budget of Titanfall and more development behind them, it was an even more difficult thing to achieve. Even though Titanfall 2 is considered to be the best game out of the 3 today, it got absolutely shafted by EA's incompetence and reluctancy to change the release date. So, what does this mean for Titanfall? Well, this marked the beginning of the sad reality for the series, because despite the want of the fans for another sequel, unfortunately, Respawn's next game wouldn't be a sequel. It would be a new game entirely that would start Respawn's rise to fame. After the disappointing sales of Titanfall 2, the future of Respawn Entertainment was looking bleak. So, in an attempt to save the studio, Electronic Arts decided to buy out the studio in 2017. Once purchased, Respawn immediately decided to begin development on a game that had been an idea of the studio since sometime in 2016. This game was designed during the early stages of Titanfall 2's development as a concept, and it took heavy inspiration from the popular, at the time, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. That concept being known today as Apex Legends. This basically meant that any future Titanfall games were being put on hold by Respawn Entertainment to focus on this new game. However, Apex was shaping up to be one of Respawn's biggest games yet, with over 115 developers being assigned to the project, nearly 30 more than what their previous title had. During the early development, Respawn decided that advanced movement mechanics like wall running would make the battle royale genre way too difficult for the average player. So they decided to exclude those mechanics from the title. This may have been a difficult decision to make, especially since the movement was so beloved by people in and out of the studio, but at the end of the day, this decision would save a lot of time on developing maps, and it would help make the universe better adapted to the battle royale mode. Also, during the development, they made the interesting choice to limit Apex to a 3-man squad, 20 teams per match game. This was a much smaller player count per match than many other battle royales had, which Respawn hoped would allow players to have a higher chance of winning. And the idea of having characters with their own unique abilities like Overwatch would help to separate the title even further from its competitors. So, after they made it through the early design stages and the concept was firmly made, development went smoothly. They managed to make this concept a reality in roughly 3 years. And with the game being complete, they would do a surprise launch of the game on February 4th, 2019, which was an extremely risky move. Apex Legends dropped out of nowhere, it felt like, with little hype or even as much as an announcement. This would lead a lot of you to believe that the game was not successful on launch. However, that was far from the case. At the time, you have to keep in mind how popular battle royales were. Fortnite was going strong and PUBG was still pretty popular. So any new title that was able to feed the stupid high demand was going to be rewarded. Respawn knew this, which is why they began developing it in the first place. And within the first 8 hours of the game being out, it achieved 1 million unique players. And by the end of the first week, Apex had achieved 50 million unique players and a maximum of 2 million concurrent players. This was an insane achievement for Respawn. It was success unlike anything they had seen since their days working for Infinity Ward. And I would argue it was even better. Apex was the new kid on the block and it was all the buzz. All of the popular streamers and YouTubers were playing the game and making content, which helped to boost the game's publicity. And with the game constantly releasing new updates and adding new content, the game would quickly become one of the biggest games of all time. The reason for the game's popularity comes down to 3 main reasons. Firstly, the game capitalized perfectly on the popularity of the relatively new genre of battle royale games. You have to keep in mind that, like I said, games like Fortnite and PUBG had only been out for a couple of years, and with all the changes that Apex brought to the formula, it made the game capable of capturing its own loyal audience. Speaking of which, the second thing that made the game so popular was the gameplay. Apex's idea to incorporate different legends and their own abilities into the battle royale genre was a great way to add a unique twist, and it was popular amongst fans. It added more competitiveness to the genre that people couldn't really find elsewhere. The way you and your squad were able to work together and use your abilities would directly dictate how a fight played out. Not to mention that you would have to counter the other team's abilities as well. This interesting gameplay, combined with the movement and popular weapons of Respawn's Titanfall franchise, made for the perfect formula for a successful shooter experience. There were some things missing from the movement, like wall running, as I mentioned earlier in the video, but the momentum-based sliding, mantling, and other mechanics that were present in Titanfall found their way into Apex. Until very recently, I think Apex had some of the best movement out of every game in its class, and that can be directly attributed to the great work that Respawn did to perfect their movement formula for Titanfall. Then, the third and the final reason for Apex's immense popularity is its timing. Apex Legends released in the summer of 2019, and as we all know, a terrible pandemic would render a lot of people locked in their homes roughly a year later. Apex was able to perfectly use this to boost their player counts into the stratosphere by continuing to pump out updates packed to the brim with new content. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, well, what does this have to do with the Titanfall franchise? Well, Apex is set in the Titanfall universe. It has Titanfall weapons, and it is set in the years after the Titanfall 2 campaign, meaning that it partially skips over the ending of Titanfall 2. And as I'll get into throughout the rest of this video, Respawn would continually choose Apex over their previous franchise, effectively leaving it in the dust. As Apex continued to get updates over the years, it began to feel like Titanfall was being abandoned, at least by avid fans of the series. Respawn effectively ceased talking about it altogether, and as they continued to develop Apex, they would consistently mismanage the storyline anytime Titanfall was mentioned. For example, in this cutscene, a Titan portrayed as a militia fighter, saving people from the evil IMC, has a Monarch logo, which was an IMC model Titan, not a militia Titan. Additionally, this cinematic portrays a legend, Bangalore, who at the time was a grunt for the IMC, and her brother encountering a cloaked pilot. In the Titanfall story, pilots are elite fighters similar to Spartans from the Halo franchise, and they would easily be able to best a simple grunt, not only because of their abilities, but also because of their combat prowess. However, apparently in the Apex story, a female and male grunt can easily best a pilot with little effort. I can go into detail about many more inconsistencies present throughout the Apex story. However, that isn't necessarily important. All you need to know is that it exists, and there are lots of it. The fact that Apex was constantly trying to associate itself with Titanfall's story irritated a lot of fans of the latter because they felt like Apex was constantly overstepping Titanfall's lore. Whether you agree with this or not, it's an opinion held by a lot of fans of the Titanfall series, and this feeling resulted in Apex and Titanfall players hating each other online. Titanfall fans resented Apex and its players for representing what they perceived as the absolute abandonment of Titanfall, and Apex fans hated Titanfall fans for looking negatively onto their favorite game. However, outside of just bastardizing Titanfall Titanfall story, Respawn would do much more to anger their fans. One of which was the constant inconsistent messaging when it came to releasing a sequel to the Titanfall series. One minute, there would be news articles saying that a Titanfall game was in the works. The next minute, another article would come out with an interview that would dispute this. Respawn have even been updating Titanfall 2 recently, potentially hitting at something big coming next. And throughout it all, Respawn has yet to make an official statement regarding this, which continues to make the future of the series seem bleaker by the day. However, the worst example of this outright disregard for the Titanfall franchise was when Respawn outright refused to save the games from being dominated by cheaters and DDoSers. Sometime in the middle of 2019, a group of hackers decided to begin ravaging Titanfall servers. They wanted the Titanfall series to be left inoperable for their own selfish reasons. They began with the original Titanfall 1. Over time, what started out as them managing to take down a few servers here and there evolved into them shutting down every server for Titanfall 1 24/7. They were able to DDoS the server so horribly that the game was quite literally unplayable. This caused outrage amongst the community because now a game that they had paid for was basically worthless. Once this occurred, it became internet-wide news, with many people outside of the Titanfall community picking up the story. This helped the Titanfall community finally have their voices heard. People were begging for them to do something. However, EA and Respawn would continue to basically do nothing. Despite Respawn directly tweeting that help was coming, months would go by without any fixes. Because of this, another group of hackers, in an effort to save Titanfall, decided to infiltrate the servers of Apex and cover every player's screen with a link to a website called SaveTitanfall.com. This website had a message begging for the series to be saved that was seen by millions as a result of the hack. This meant that Respawn and EA's consistent disregard for the Titanfall franchise was finally starting to affect their biggest game. And their response to this was absolutely shocking. Instead of fixing Titanfall 1's vulnerabilities, they instead removed it from all storefronts to avoid any sort of legal action. This once again showed their true colors to the community, causing many to build a hatred for the people behind the series. However, even though Titanfall 1 was removed, the hackers were still not done. These hackers wouldn't just stop at the now 5-year-old game. They would actually start to attack Titanfall 2, which was the fans' biggest nightmare. The hackers would start by targeting streamers and major names in the community. This distilled fear in a lot of members of the community that still played Titanfall 2, because at any moment, they could be the hackers' next victim. And as time went on, those hackers got better, and they managed to start injecting malware into player systems that were playing Titanfall. This meant that anyone who played Titanfall was at risk of having their computer compromised. And once again, despite the game being completely overran with exploits, the community had to step in and fix it themselves, since at the time, Titanfall 2 only had 2 developers assigned to the game's upkeep. The community did this by having a group of developers band together to create a modded client to Titanfall 2 called the North Star client. This client protected players from the hacking issue, added new game modes, and added modding capabilities. This new client would be released in October of 2022, which was good news for the community, and it goes to show how strong the Titanfall community is. However, this also showed the sad state of the Titanfall series because Respawn and EA did nothing to solve the problem until years later. And on top of that, when they were confronted with these issues with Titanfall 1, they just decided to delete it from existence and they entirely ignored the problem. I will say, in Respawn's defense, they did fix the game servers at some point in 2023, but this was obviously way too late. And after all of this, the Titanfall series' future does not look bright. The people behind the series have shown consistently that they do not actually care about the series. Despite what they say on Twitter, they have done little when it comes to promoting the series. They haven't been working on a sequel, and it took them a long time to fix the hacking problem. So long, in fact, that the Titanfall community released a fix faster than they could. Now, don't get me wrong, if Respawn wants to move on to their new game, Apex, and leave Titanfall behind, they have the total right to do so. However, I'm telling this video from the Titanfall fans' perspective, because I am one. And as time goes on, I and many others are more and more worried about the series' future. The series is just in the sad state. There's no other way to put it. And I hope I'm wrong, but it seems like the idea of a sequel that ends the story given to us in Titanfall 2 is quite slim. I really do hope that one day a sequel will surface, because Titanfall is genuinely one of the best franchises ever made, and it will go down as an absolute cult classic. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see if it actually happens. Anyways, that's going to wrap up today's video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. If you did, I make similar content to this on a semi-regular basis, so go ahead and subscribe to the channel and follow me on Twitter if you don't want to miss the next upload. Now, if you want to watch another video just like this one, I'll be popping up on your screen right now that I'm sure you'll enjoy. I'll see you next time, friends, and peace.